Story 1. The Vanishing Campers. It was supposed to be a routine night shift for Ranger Tom, who had worked at the remote mountain park for nearly a decade. The park was known for its dense forests and winding trails, often frequented by seasoned hikers and campers looking to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. But the isolation also came with its share of eerie stories, and Ranger Tom had heard them all, until he became part of one. It was a chilly autumn night when the call came in. 2 campers were reported missing by their friends, who had stayed behind in a nearby campground. According to them, the pair had gone off trail to explore a hidden waterfall, promising to return by sunset. But when darkness fell and they were still not back, their friends grew worried and contacted the park rangers. Ranger Tom set out immediately, accompanied by his trusty search dog Max. The trail to the waterfall was not well marked, but it was known to locals as a place of serene beauty and ominous mystery. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife seemed to vanish. An eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the crunching of leaves under Tom's boots and the occasional whine from Max. When they finally reached the waterfall, the scene was almost surreal. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting ghostly shadows on the surrounding rocks. But there was no sign of the campers. No tents, no backpacks, not even footprints. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Tom scoured the area, calling out their names, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the thick forest. Just as he was about to radio for backup, Max began barking furiously, his hackles raised. The dog's behavior sent a chill down Tom's spine. Max was well trained and rarely reacted this way. Following Max's lead, Tom found himself standing at the edge of a steep ravine. The drop was sheer and unforgiving, but something else caught his eye. A faint light flickered from the depths below. Ignoring his better judgment, Tom began to descend, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. What he found at the bottom was a scene of pure horror. The missing campers were there, but they were not alone. Surrounding them were strange symbols etched into the ground, and a figure cloaked in shadow seemed to hover over them. The campers were in a trance, their eyes wide open but unseeing, as if they were under some kind of spell. Before Tom could react, the figure turned to face him. Its eyes, glowing a sickly green, bored into his soul, freezing him in place. Max barked louder, snapping Tom out of his stupor. Without thinking, Tom grabbed the campers and dragged them up the ravine, not daring to look back. When they'd finally reached safety, the campers awoke, confused and terrified. They had no memory of what had happened or how they had ended up at the bottom of the ravine. Ranger Tom, too, was left with more questions than answers. To this day, he refuses to speak of that night, but he never returned to the waterfall, and neither did anyone else. Story 2. The Unseen Watcher. Ranger Sarah had always felt a deep connection to the vast wilderness she patrolled. The towering pines and crystal-clear lakes were her sanctuary, a place where she could clear her mind and feel at peace. But one summer, that peace was shattered by an experience she would never forget. It started with the reports. Hikers returning from the remote northern trails mentioned feeling uneasy, as if they were being watched. Some even claimed to hear footsteps behind them, only to turn around and find no one there. Most dismissed it as paranoia, but Ranger Sarah decided to investigate. She set out alone, following the trail that wound through the dense forest. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made her heart race. She kept her hand on her radio, ready to call for help if needed. Hours passed, and the feeling only intensified. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but she pressed on, determined to find the source of the disturbance. As she rounded a bend in the trail, she froze. Ahead of her, partially hidden behind a tree, was a figure. It was tall and shadowy, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin to be human. The figure didn't move, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, watching her every move. She called out, but there was no response. Mustering her courage, she took a step forward, and the figure vanished. Just like that, it was gone, as if it had never been there. Shaken, Sarah decided to head back. But as she turned, she heard a voice, a low, raspy whisper, coming from the direction of the vanished figure. "Leave," it said, the word echoing in her mind. "You are not welcome here." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She bolted down the trail, not stopping until she reached her vehicle. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled with the keys, desperate to put as much distance as possible between her and whatever that thing was. She reported the incident to her superiors, but no trace of the figure was ever found. The northern trails were closed off, officially due to dangerous wildlife activity, but Sarah knew the truth. Something was out there, something not of this world, and it didn't want to be disturbed. Story 3. The Ghosts of the Old Ranger Station. Deep within the forest, hidden from the main roads and popular trails, lies the old ranger station. Built in the early 1900s, it once served as the hub for park rangers during the early days of the park. But over the years, as new facilities were built closer to the entrance, the old station was abandoned, left to decay in the wilderness. Ranger Mike had always been fascinated by the old station. It was a piece of history, a relic of a bygone era, but it also had a dark reputation. According to local legend, the station was haunted by the spirits of rangers who had died under mysterious circumstances. Mike didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't resist the lure of the old station. One evening, he decided to visit the station after his shift. It was a long hike through the forest, and by the time he reached the station, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the crumbling building. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay, and the only sounds were the distant calls of owls. As he approached the entrance, Mike felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air became icy cold, and a chill ran down his spine. Ignoring the feeling, he pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was just as he had imagined, dusty and abandoned, with old furniture covered in cobwebs. But there was something else, something he hadn't expected. The walls were covered in writing. Hundreds of names, dates, and messages, all carved into the wood. Some were faded and barely legible, while others looked fresh, as if they had been carved only recently. As Mike explored the station, he began to feel uneasy. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Then he heard it, a faint, whispering voice. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the far end of the station, from a room that had been sealed off for decades. Against his better judgment, Mike approached the room. The door was heavy and rusted, but he managed to pry it open. Inside, the room was pitch black, the only light coming from his flashlight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as he fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if the voices were all around him, closing in. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the door flew open and he stumbled out, gasping for air. He didn't stop to look back as he ran out of the station and into the night. To this day, Mike refuses to talk about what he saw in the old ranger station, but he never went back, and neither did anyone else. The station remains abandoned, a ghostly reminder of a time long past, and of the spirits that still linger within its walls. Story 4. The Creature in the Woods. Ranger Pate had heard all sorts of wild stories during his time working at the national park. Tales of Bigfoot sightings, mysterious lights in the sky, and even the occasional ghost story. But he had always dismissed them as nothing more than campfire tales, stories told to scare newcomers and tourists. That is, until the night he encountered something he couldn't explain. It was a quiet night in the park, with only a few campers spread out in the various campsites. Pete was on patrol, making his rounds, when he received a call on his radio. A camper had reported hearing strange noises coming from the woods near their site, growls and howls that didn't sound like any animal they had ever heard. Pete headed to the campsite, expecting to find nothing more than a scared camper and maybe a coyote or two. But when he arrived, he found the campers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. They'd pointed to the edge of the woods where the sounds were coming from. Pete shone his flashlight into the darkness, but the beam barely penetrated the thick trees. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and Pete realized that whatever was making the noise was getting closer. He radioed for backup, but deep down, he knew it would be too late. Suddenly, the creature emerged from the woods, just at the edge of the light. It was massive, covered in thick, matted fur, with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. Its teeth were long and sharp, and its breath came in ragged, huffing bursts. Pete had never seen anything like it, and he knew immediately that this was no ordinary animal. The creature let out a deafening roar, sending the campers scrambling back to their tents. Pete stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should run, but something kept him rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the beast. For a moment, the creature seemed to study him, its yellow eyes narrowing. Then, without warning, it turned and bolted back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. The growls faded into the night, leaving only the sound of Pete's ragged breathing. When backup arrived, Pete tried to explain what he had seen, but the words wouldn't come. The other rangers searched the area, but they found no trace of the creature. No tracks, no fur, nothing. It was as if it had never been there. But Pete knew what he had seen, and it haunted him. From that night on, he never patrolled the park alone after dark. The memory of those glowing yellow eyes and the creature's unearthly roar stayed with him, a reminder that some things in the woods are best left undisturbed. Story 5. The Woman in White. Ranger Lucas had been working at the park for several years, and in that time, he had seen his fair share of strange things. But nothing compared to the encounter he had one cold winter night while patrolling the park's more remote trails. It was late, and a heavy fog had settled over the park, making visibility almost non-existent. Lucas had been making his rounds, checking on the few campers brave enough to venture out during the off-season. The park was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife muffled by the thick fog. As he drove down the winding dirt road, Lucas noticed something moving in the mist up ahead. At first, he thought it was an animal, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person, a woman, dressed in a long, flowing white gown. She was walking slowly, almost as if she were gliding over the ground, her figure barely visible through the fog. Lucas stopped the vehicle and called out to her, asking if she needed help. But the woman didn't respond. Instead, she continued to walk, heading deeper into the woods. Concerned, Lucas got out of his vehicle and followed her, his flashlight cutting through the fog. He called out again, but still, she didn't respond. Lucas quickened his pace, determined to catch up with her before she got too far. But no matter how fast he walked, the woman always seemed to stay just out of reach, her white gown floating like a ghostly apparition through the trees. As he followed her deeper into the forest, Lucas began to feel a growing sense of unease. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. The woman never looked back, never acknowledged his presence, and Lucas began to wonder if she even knew he was there. Finally, the woman stopped at the edge of a cliff overlooking a frozen lake. She stood there, staring out at the water, her figure still and silent. Lucas approached cautiously, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. When he was just a few feet away, the woman turned to face him. Her eyes were hollow and empty, and her skin was deathly pale. Lucas froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, before he could react, she turned and stepped off the cliff, disappearing into the fog below. Panicked, Lucas rushed to the edge, expecting to see her body on the ice below. But when he looked down, there was nothing, no sign of the woman, no footprints, no disturbance in the snow. It was as if she had never been there. Shaken, Lucas returned to his vehicle and radioed for help. A search team was dispatched, but they found no trace of the woman in white. The park's records showed no reports of a missing person matching her description, and no one had seen her enter the park. To this day, Ranger Lucas believes he encountered a ghost that night, the spirit of a woman who had met a tragic end in the park many years before. But whoever she was, her image continues to haunt him, a reminder of the mysteries that still linger in the park's shadowy depths. Story 6. The Haunted Cabin. Ranger Emily had heard the stories about the old cabin on the lake, how it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. But she was a skeptic, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. That is, until the night she spent alone in the cabin. It was late autumn, and the park was preparing to close for the season. Emily had been assigned to check on the cabin, ensuring it was secure before the winter snows arrived. The cabin was isolated, situated on the far side of the lake, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail through the woods. By the time Emily arrived, the sun had set and a cold wind was blowing in from the lake. The cabin was old and weathered, its wooden walls creaking in the wind. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. As she went about her inspection, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional groan of the wind against the walls, but there was an oppressive presence in the air, something unseen but deeply unsettling. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but the feeling only grew stronger. Then, as she was securing the windows, she heard it, a faint, scratching sound coming from the walls. At first, she thought it might be an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Emily followed the sound to the back room of the cabin, where she found an old, dusty chest pushed against the wall. The scratching was coming from inside. Her heart raced as she approached the chest, every instinct telling her to leave it alone, but her curiosity got the better of her. She opened the chest, and the scratching stopped. Inside, she found nothing but a few old blankets and a rusted lantern. Confused, she closed the chest, but as soon as she did, the scratching started again, this time louder, more insistent. Panicking, Emily backed away from the chest, her eyes darting around the room. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. She knew she had to get out, but her legs wouldn't move. Just as she thought she would faint from fear, the figure vanished, and the cabin was silent once more. Without wasting a moment, Emily grabbed her things and fled the cabin, running down the trail as fast as she could. She never spoke of what she saw that night, but she refused to return to the cabin, even in broad daylight. The park eventually closed the cabin to the public, citing structural issues, but those who knew the stories believed it was something more. To this day, the cabin remains abandoned, a dark and foreboding place on the edge of the lake. And though it is off-limits, some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the scratching coming from within its walls. Story 7. The Disappearing Lights. Ranger Jake had always been drawn to the remote parts of the park, the areas where few visitors ventured. There was something peaceful about the solitude, the untouched beauty of the wilderness. But one night, that solitude turned into something far more sinister. It was late summer, and Jake was on a routine patrol of the park's northern boundary, a rugged and rarely traveled area. As he drove along the narrow dirt road, he noticed something unusual, lights in the distance, flickering among the trees. At first, he thought it might be campers, though it was odd for anyone to be out there so late. Curious, Jake decided to investigate. He parked his vehicle and set off on foot, following the lights as they moved deeper into the forest. The lights were strange, bright, almost like lanterns, but they moved too quickly, darting between the trees as if they were alive. Jake tried to keep up, but no matter how fast he walked, the lights always stayed just out of reach. As he ventured further into the woods, the lights grew brighter, more intense, until they suddenly stopped, hovering in a small clearing ahead. Jake cautiously approached the clearing, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. The lights weren't coming from lanterns or flashlights. They were floating, suspended in midair, without any visible source. They pulsed with an unnatural glow, casting eerie shadows across the trees. Jake stood there, frozen in place, as the lights began to move in unison, forming a circle around him. The air grew thick with electricity, and a low hum filled his ears. He felt a strange pressure in his chest, as if the very air around him was closing in. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished, plunging the clearing into darkness. Jake was left standing alone, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should leave, but his legs felt like lead, unable to move. It wasn't until he heard the rustling of leaves behind him that he snapped out of his trance. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent forest. Jake didn't wait to see if the lights would return. He bolted out of the clearing, running back to his vehicle as fast as he could. When he finally reached the safety of his truck, he radioed for backup, but his voice was shaky, his words barely coherent. The other rangers searched the area, but found no trace of the lights or anything unusual. The incident was chalked up to fatigue and overwork, But Jake knew what he had seen was real. The lights were still out there, somewhere in the depths of the forest, waiting to appear again. Story 8. The Cursed Trail. Ranger Alex had always loved the old trails that wound through the park. They were quieter, less traveled, and offered a glimpse into the park's history. But there was one trail he had always avoided, the old logging road that cut through the heart of the forest. It was said to be cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had died there long ago. One day, after hearing a new ranger express interest in the trail, Alex decided to take him there, eager to share the park's history and debunk the old legends. The trail was overgrown and barely visible, a narrow path that twisted through the dense woods. As they walked, Alex told the story of the trail's dark past, how it had been used by loggers in the early 1900s, many of whom had died in accidents or from the harsh conditions. Over the years, hikers reported strange occurrences on the trail, voices in the wind, footsteps in the shadows, and a feeling of being watched. The new ranger listened with interest, but Alex could tell he was skeptical. They continued down the trail, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. But as they went deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. Alex felt a growing sense of unease, but he pushed it aside, determined to prove the trail was just a trail, nothing more. Then they heard it, a low, mournful wail, echoing through the trees. The new ranger stopped in his tracks, his face pale. Alex tried to laugh it off, saying it was just the wind, but deep down he wasn't so sure. As they continued, the wailing grew louder, more intense, as if whatever was making the noise was following them. The new ranger looked visibly shaken, and Alex could feel his own nerves beginning to fray. Finally, they reached the end of the trail, where the old logging camp had once stood. The clearing was empty, save for a few crumbling stone foundations, but the air was thick with an oppressive energy. The wailing had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on them. Suddenly, the new ranger let out a gasp, pointing to the edge of the clearing. There, standing among the trees, was a figure, a man, dressed in old-fashioned logging clothes, his face hidden in shadow. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Alex could feel its eyes on him, watching. Without a word, Alex turned and started back down the trail, the new ranger close behind. They didn't stop until they were out of the woods, the cursed trail far behind them. Neither of them spoke about what they had seen, but the new ranger never asked to visit that trail again. From that day on, Alex avoided the old logging road, and whenever he heard the distant wail of the wind through the trees, he couldn't help but wonder if the spirits of the past were still there, haunting the trail that had claimed so many lives. Story 9. The Laughing Man. Ranger Dave was used to the solitude of night shifts. He enjoyed the stillness of the forest, the way the darkness seemed to envelop the world, muffling sounds and creating an almost meditative atmosphere. But one night, his peaceful routine was shattered by an encounter that still haunts him. It was a moonless night, the kind where the darkness is so complete that even familiar surroundings take on an unfamiliar and unsettling quality. Dave was making his rounds, driving slowly along one of the park's less traveled roads, when he heard something strange over the hum of his vehicle's engine, a faint sound that seemed out of place in the otherwise quiet night. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but as he continued to drive, the sound grew louder. It was unmistakably human, laughter, but not the joyful kind. This laughter was low, raspy, and filled with a sinister edge that sent a shiver down Dave's spine. Curious and concerned, Dave slowed the vehicle and rolled down his window, trying to pinpoint the source of the laughter. It seemed to be coming from a dense section of woods off the side of the road. He stopped the truck, grabbed his flashlight, and cautiously stepped out. As soon as he left the safety of his vehicle, the laughter stopped. The sudden silence was unnerving, but Dave was a seasoned ranger, not easily spooked. He called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no reply, just the thick, oppressive quiet of the forest. Dave swept his flashlight across the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar shapes of trees and underbrush. But then, something moved at the edge of the light, something that made Dave's blood run cold. A man was standing just inside the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows. He was tall and thin, dressed in ragged clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in years. His face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes glinted with a strange, almost manic intensity. But what unnerved Dave the most was the man's smile, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across his face, showing far too many teeth. The man didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, grinning at Dave with that horrible, unsettling smile. Before Dave could react, the man's laughter began again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. Before Dave could react, the man's laughter began again, louder this time, echoing through the trees like some sort of deranged melody. The laughter was no longer just unsettling. It was terrifying, growing louder and more hysterical with each passing second. Dave felt his heart race as the sound seemed to wrap around him, squeezing the air from his lungs. Without thinking, Dave took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to get out of there. But as he moved, the man's laughter abruptly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even worse. The man's grin never faltered, and for a split second, it seemed to stretch impossibly wider, as if his face was warping into some grotesque caricature. Dave could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he stood frozen, caught in the gaze of those maniacal eyes. Then, without warning, the man lunged forward, his movements unnaturally fast and fluid. In a panic, Dave turned and sprinted back to his vehicle, not daring to look back. He'd fumbled with the door handle, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he scrambled to get inside. Slamming the door shut, Dave locked it and started the engine, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the figure was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. Dave floored the gas pedal, speeding down the road and away from the spot as fast as he could. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? How had he moved so quickly? And that laughter. Dave knew he would never forget that sound. When he finally reached the ranger station, Dave was still shaking. He reported the incident, but when his fellow rangers went back to investigate, there was no sign of the man. No footprints, no disturbed brush, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. Dave's superiors chalked it up to stress or a trick of the mind, but Dave knew better. Something was out there in those woods, something dangerous and malevolent. He never took the night shift again, and whenever he drove past that section of the road during the day, he could almost hear the faint echo of that deranged laughter in the distance. Story 10. The Abandoned Campground. Ranger Laura had been working at the park for nearly 5 years when she first heard about the abandoned campground. It was an old site, long since closed to the public after a series of mysterious accidents had led to several disappearances. The area had a reputation among the rangers, a place where no one wanted to go, especially after dark. But one late summer evening, Laura was assigned to patrol that section of the park, as there had been reports of illegal campers setting up in the restricted area. She wasn't thrilled about it, but she was a professional, and it was her job to check it out. The road leading to the old campground was overgrown and barely passable, the trees on either side closing in like the jaws of some great beast. As Laura drove deeper into the forest, the shadows grew longer, and the familiar sounds of the park faded away, replaced by an unsettling stillness. When she finally reached the campground, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the area in a dim, fading light. The place was exactly as she had imagined. Dilapidated picnic tables, rusted fire pits, and crumbling cabins that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Laura parked her vehicle and stepped out, her flashlight cutting through the encroaching darkness. She called out, expecting to hear the voices of the illegal campers, but there was no response. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the gravel as she made her way through the deserted campsite. As she approached one of the old cabins, she noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. A chill ran down her spine as she pushed the door open, revealing the cabin's dark, empty interior. The air inside was stale, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. Suddenly, Laura felt a cold breeze brush past her, even though the air outside was still. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she could have sworn she heard faint whispers, barely audible, coming from the corners of the room. She quickly swept her flashlight across the cabin, but it revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just old, decaying furniture and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. As she turned to leave, Laura noticed something that hadn't been there before, a set of fresh footprints in the dust, leading deeper into the cabin. Her heart pounded in her chest as she followed the tracks, which seemed to lead to a back room. The whispers grew louder as she approached the door, now unmistakable, a chorus of voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. With a trembling hand, Laura reached for the door and pushed it open, revealing a small, empty room. But it wasn't empty. In the center of the room, etched into the floor, was a large, intricate symbol, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The air around it was frigid, and the whispers reached a fever pitch, swirling around her like a cold wind. Terrified, Laura backed away, her mind racing as the symbol seemed to pulse with energy. She didn't know what it was or what it meant, but she knew she had to get out of there. She turned and ran from the cabin, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she fled back to her vehicle. As she sped away from the campground, Laura could still hear the whispers in her ears, though she was miles away. When she finally reached the ranger station, she was visibly shaken, barely able to explain what had happened. The abandoned campground was officially closed off for good after that night, and no one was allowed to go near it. But Laura knew that whatever was out there, whatever dark presence lingered in that old campsite, was still waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to stumble upon it. Story 11. The Eyes in the Dark. Ranger Ben was known among his colleagues as the brave one, the ranger who would go where others feared to tread. But even he had his limits, and those limits were tested one fateful night when he encountered something in the park that defied explanation. It was a cold winter evening, and Ben was patrolling a remote section of the park known for its dense forests and treacherous terrain. The area was notorious for being difficult to navigate, especially in the dark, but Ben had walked these trails many times before and knew them like the back of his hand. As he hiked through the forest, the sound of snow crunching underfoot was the only noise breaking the silence. The trees were tall and close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving the trail in near-complete darkness. Ben had just reached a small clearing when he noticed something strange. A pair of glowing eyes staring at him from the shadows. At first, he thought it was just a deer or another animal, but as he focused his flashlight on the eyes, he realized they were too high off the ground to belong to any creature he knew. The eyes were a deep, unnatural shade of red, and they seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Ben's breath caught in his throat as he tried to make out the figure behind the eyes, but the darkness was too thick, and the light from his flashlights seemed to dim the closer he got. The eyes never blinked, never moved, just stared at him with an intensity that made Ben's skin crawl. He felt a wave of cold wash over him, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped several degrees. His instincts told him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey, frozen in place by fear. Suddenly, the eyes began to move, gliding silently through the trees toward him. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he finally managed to break free from his paralysis. He turned and bolted down the trail, not daring to look back, but he could feel the presence behind him, gaining ground with every step. The trees seemed to close in around him as he ran, the branches clawing at his clothes and face. The air grew colder, and the sound of his own breathing was deafening in his ears. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes were still watching him, still following him. When he finally reached the ranger station, Ben was exhausted and shaking, his mind reeling from the encounter. He tried to explain what had happened to his fellow rangers, but the words wouldn't come. How could he describe something so terrifying, so inexplicable? Ben never went back to that part of the park, and whenever he talked about that night, he would only say one thing. There's something out there, something that shouldn't be. And whatever it is, it's watching. Story 12. The Cursed Lake. Ranger Kelly had always been drawn to the park's lakes, finding peace in the stillness of the water and the beauty of the surrounding landscape. But one lake in particular, known as Blackwater Lake, had a reputation that kept most visitors, and even rangers, away. It was said to be cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had drowned in its dark, murky waters. One late autumn evening, Kelly was assigned to patrol the area around Blackwater Lake. She wasn't superstitious, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease as she approached the lake, the sky darkening with the setting sun. The air was thick with fog, and the water was as black as ink, reflecting the twisted shapes of the bare trees along the shore. As she walked along the shoreline, Kelly noticed something strange. A small boat, barely visible through the fog, drifting aimlessly in the center of the lake. It was old and weathered, its wooden planks creaking as it moved slowly across the water. There was no sign of anyone in the boat, no oars, and no movement. Kelly tried to radio for backup, but her radio crackled with static, the signal too weak to reach the ranger station. She was alone, with no way to call for help, but she knew she had to investigate. She found a small rowboat tied to a nearby dock, and after a moment's hesitation, climbed in and began rowing toward the drifting boat. The water was eerily calm as she made her way across the lake, the fog closing in around her, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As she approached the boat, Kelly could feel her heart racing, a deep sense of dread settling over her. When she finally reached the boat, she saw that it was even older than she had thought, covered in moss and barnacles, as if it had been sitting in the water for decades. But what really caught her attention was what lay inside. The boat was filled with waterlogged clothing, shoes, and personal belongings, old, decayed, and covered in mud. But there was something else, something that made Kelly's blood run cold. In the center of the boat was a single, tattered life jacket, its faded color barely visible through the muck. And attached to the life jacket was a photograph, its edges worn and frayed. Kelly picked up the photo with trembling hands, wiping away the dirt to reveal the image. It was of a family, a mother, father, and two young children, all smiling happily for the camera. But the faces of the children were scratched out, leaving only empty spaces where their eyes should have been. A sudden chill ran through Kelly as she realized what she was holding. This wasn't just any boat, it was the boat from the tragic accident that had occurred years ago when a family had drowned in the lake, their bodies never recovered. As she looked up, she noticed the fog had thickened and the shoreline had disappeared from view. The lake was completely silent, the water unnervingly still. Kelly's breath caught in her throat as she felt something brush against the side of her boat, a cold, clammy hand reaching up from the depths. Panicking, she dropped the photograph and frantically began rowing back to shore, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the oars. The boat moved sluggishly, as if something beneath the surface was trying to pull her back. When she finally reached the dock, Kelly leaped out of the boat and ran, not stopping until she was far away from the cursed lake. She never spoke of what she had seen, but she knew she would never return to Blackwater Lake. The park officials later closed off the area, citing safety concerns, but those who knew the stories believed it was to keep whatever haunted the lake from claiming any more lives. Story 13. The Whispering Woods. Ranger Christ had always felt at home in the forest. The towering trees, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the chorus of birds were a comforting backdrop to his daily routine. But there was one section of the park that he avoided, the area known as the Whispering Woods. The rangers all knew the stories, strange sounds, eerie voices, and a sense of being watched. Chris had always dismissed the tales as just that, stories, until he found himself patrolling the area one cold autumn night. It started like any other shift. Chris was tasked with checking on some remote trails, making sure they were clear for the upcoming hunting season. The sun had just set, and the forest was bathed in the dim, golden light of dusk. As he walked, the familiar sounds of the forest began to fade, replaced by an unsettling silence. The trail led him deeper into the Whispering Woods, and the farther he went, the more uneasy he felt. The trees here were older, their branches twisted and gnarled, forming a dense canopy that blocked out what little light remained. Chris could feel the temperature drop as he moved forward, a cold breeze chilling him to the bone. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, so soft that he almost missed it. He stopped, straining to listen, but the whispering stopped. Shaking it off as the wind playing tricks on his mind, Chris continued down the trail. But the further he went, the louder the whispers became. They seemed to come from all around him, disembodied voices that he couldn't quite make out. Chris felt his heart rate quicken as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to him, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. He couldn't understand the words, but they filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. He picked up his pace, trying to ignore the whispers, but they followed him, growing louder with each step. The voices were coming from the trees, the shadows, the very air around him. His flashlight began to flicker, the beam of light cutting in and out as if the batteries were dying. Panic set in as Chris realized he was no longer on the trail. The trees closed in around him, the path ahead obscured by darkness. He turned in circles, trying to find his way back, but every direction looked the same, twisted trees and impenetrable shadows. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices now clear and distinct. They called his name, taunting him, urging him to go deeper into the woods. Chris felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he fought the urge to run. He knew if he lost control, he might never find his way out. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, leaving Chris disoriented and terrified. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move, a shadow flitting between the trees, too fast to be human. Chris backed away, his flashlight flickering out completely, plunging him into darkness. He stumbled, nearly falling as he turned to run, the shadows closing in around him. He could feel something watching him, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Blind with fear, Chris ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. He didn't stop until he burst out of the trees, back onto the main trail, gasping for breath. The whispers were gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of the forest at night. When he finally made it back to the ranger station, Chris was shaken and exhausted. He never spoke of what had happened in the Whispering Woods, but he never went back either. The area was officially off-limits after that, the rangers citing safety concerns, but the truth was far more sinister. The Whispering Woods were alive with something dark, something ancient, and it had let Chris go, for now. Story 14. The Phantom Fire. Ranger Beth had always prided herself on her calm demeanor, even in the face of danger. Working in a remote park meant dealing with everything from wild animals to lost hikers, and she had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared her for the night she encountered the Phantom Fire. It was the height of summer, and the park was unusually dry. Wildfire warnings were in effect, and every ranger was on high alert. Beth was on patrol, driving along one of the park's more isolated roads when she saw it, a bright orange glow in the distance. Her heart sank as she realized what it was, a fire spreading quickly through the dry brush. She grabbed her radio and called it in, then sped toward the blaze, hoping she could contain it before it got out of control. As she got closer, the flames grew larger, the heat intense even from a distance. But something was off. The fire wasn't behaving like any she had ever seen. The flames danced and flickered, but there was no smoke, no crackling of burning wood. It was as if the fire was suspended in time, an unnatural and eerie sight. Beth skidded to a stop and jumped out of her vehicle, grabbing the fire extinguisher from the back. But as she approached the flames, they seemed to retreat, moving away from her, deeper into the forest. She followed, trying to get close enough to douse the fire, but it was as if the flames were leading her somewhere. She stopped and watched in confusion as the fire moved further away, flickering in the darkness like a ghostly beacon. The air around her was cool, far too cool for a fire of that size, and there was still no smoke, just the eerie, silent glow of the flames. Beth hesitated, unsure of what to do. The fire didn't seem to be spreading or consuming anything, and the ground beneath it was untouched, as if the flames weren't even real. But they were there, dancing in the night, taunting her. Just as she decided to call for backup, the flames vanished. One moment they were there, bright and burning, and the next they were gone, leaving only darkness and the quiet hum of the forest. Beth stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as if the fire had never existed at all. She slowly made her way back to her vehicle, her mind racing. When she reached the ranger station, she reported what she had seen, but there was no evidence of a fire, no burn marks, no smoke, nothing to suggest that anything had happened. The other rangers were skeptical, but Beth knew what she had seen. The phantom fire was real, and it had lured her into the woods for reasons she couldn't understand. She never encountered it again, but every time she patrolled that section of the park, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fire was still out there, waiting to appear again. Story 15. The Shadow in the Cabin. Ranger Tim had always enjoyed working in the old ranger cabins scattered throughout the park. They were small and rustic, but they offered a quiet place to rest and recharge during long shifts. But there was one cabin, Cabin 13, that no one liked to stay in. It was said to be haunted, and even the most seasoned rangers avoided it whenever possible. One night, Tim found himself assigned to stay in cabin 13. The other cabins were all occupied, and there was no choice but to spend the night there. Tim wasn't superstitious, but he had heard the stories, strange noises, objects moving on their own, and a feeling of being watched. As he approached the cabin, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and creaking in the wind. The trees around it were tall and close together, casting long dark shadows that seemed to move in the corner of his eye. Tim pushed the door open and stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The cabin was small, with just a bed, a table, and a wood stove for warmth. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and damp earth, and the only light came from the small, flickering oil lamp on the table. He set his gear down and tried to settle in, but the cabin felt wrong, heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on him. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just his imagination, and began preparing for the night. As the hours passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and the cabin creaked and groaned as if it were alive. Tim sat by the stove, trying to focus on his book, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. Then he heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from the back of the cabin. Tim froze, his heart racing as he listened. The sound was soft, almost like footsteps, but it was too slow, too deliberate to be an animal. He slowly stood, the floorboards creaking under his feet, and made his way to the back of the cabin. The shuffling stopped as he approached, and the air grew colder, as if something was sucking the warmth out of the room. Tim reached the back of the cabin and saw nothing, just shadows playing tricks on his mind. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding and turned to head back to the stove. But as he did, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, a dark shape just at the edge of the light. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the corner, but there was nothing there. The shadows shifted and moved, but they were just shadows, weren't they? Tim's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. Suddenly, the oil lamp on the table flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Tim's breath caught in his throat as the temperature dropped further, the cold seeping into his bones. He fumbled for his flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the thick, oppressive dark. Then, from the shadows, he saw it, a figure, tall and thin, with long, bony limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It was just a shadow, but it moved, slowly, deliberately, as if it were alive. Tim backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't follow, just stood there, watching him with those empty, glowing eyes. He could feel the weight of its gaze, a cold, suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. Without thinking, Tim grabbed his gear and bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until he was far down the trail, the cabin a distant speck behind him. He didn't know what he had seen, but he knew he would never return to cabin 13. The next day, Tim reported the incident, but the other rangers found nothing unusual in the cabin, no sign of the figure, no cold spots, nothing out of place. But Tim knew what he had seen, and he wasn't the only one. The stories about cabin 13 continued to circulate, and it remained the one place in the park where no ranger wanted to spend the night. Story 16. The Ghostly Hitchhiker. Ranger Ellie had heard all sorts of strange tales during her time at the park, but there was one story that stood out among the rest, the tale of the ghostly hitchhiker. Locals whispered about a young woman who had died in a car accident on a remote stretch of the park's road years ago. It was said that on foggy nights, she would appear by the roadside, seeking a ride to a destination she would never reach. One particularly foggy night, Ellie was driving back to the ranger station after a long day in the field. The fog was thick, swallowing the headlights of her vehicle and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. She drove slowly, the road winding through the dense forest, her thoughts focused on getting back to the warmth and safety of the station. As she rounded a bend in the road, she saw something up ahead. A figure standing by the roadside, barely visible through the fog. Ellie slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her long hair hanging loose around her shoulders. The woman didn't move as Ellie approached, just stood there, staring out at the road with a fallen expression. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she remembered the stories, but she shook off the feeling, telling herself it was just a lost hiker. She pulled over and rolled down her window. "Are you okay?" "Do you need a ride?" Ellie called out. The woman slowly turned to face her, and Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. The woman's face was pale, almost translucent, with dark, sunken eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness. For a moment, the two just stared at each other, the fog swirling around them. Then, without a word, the woman nodded and began walking toward the car. Ellie hesitated but unlocked the passenger door, watching as the woman climbed inside. The air inside the vehicle grew cold, and Ellie shivered as she pulled back onto the road. They drove in silence, the woman sitting eerily still in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Ellie tried to make conversation, asking the woman where she needed to go, but the woman didn't respond. She just sat there, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze distant and unfocused. After what felt like an eternity, Ellie reached a crossroads where she needed to turn. She glanced over at the woman to ask which way to go, but when she did, the passenger seat was empty. The woman was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the lingering cold. Ellie slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked around, but there was no sign of the woman. She was alone on the dark, foggy road. Trembling, Ellie quickly drove back to the ranger station, her mind racing with what had just happened. When she arrived, she told the other rangers about her encounter, but they just nodded knowingly. "You've seen the hitchhiker," one of them said quietly. "You're not the first." Ellie never saw the ghostly hitchhiker again, but the memory of that night stayed with her. Every time she drove that stretch of road, especially on foggy nights, she couldn't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see the woman sitting there once more, waiting for a ride to nowhere. Story 17. The Screams in the Canyon. Ranger Mark had always been drawn to the park's more rugged areas, the steep canyons, rocky cliffs, and hidden valleys that most visitors never saw. He enjoyed the challenge of navigating the difficult terrain, the sense of adventure that came with exploring the park's most remote corners. But one evening, his love for exploration led him into a nightmare he would never forget. It was late in the afternoon when Mark decided to check out a particularly isolated canyon that had recently been added to his patrol route. The canyon was known for its sheer cliffs and treacherous trails, but Mark was confident in his abilities and set out without hesitation. As he descended into the canyon, the light began to fade, the sun dipping behind the towering walls. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick and still, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under his boots. Suddenly, Mark heard something that made him stop in his tracks, a faint, distant scream echoing through the canyon. He froze, straining to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. He dismissed it as the wind or perhaps an animal, but as he continued down the trail, the scream came again, this time louder, more urgent. Mark's heart began to race as he quickened his pace, his flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness. The screams grew louder with each step, reverberating off the canyon walls, creating a disorienting, echoing effect. They were human screams, filled with terror and pain, but there was something off about them, something unnatural. He reached a narrow ledge overlooking a deep chasm and stopped, shining his light down into the darkness below. The screams seemed to be coming from the depths of the canyon, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't see anyone down there. Mark called out, asking if anyone needed help, but the only response was another scream, this one closer, more desperate. He felt a wave of cold wash over him, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. As he stood there, trying to decide what to do, the screams suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The canyon, which had been filled with the sounds of terror just moments before, was now deathly quiet. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he realized he was completely alone in the darkness, the oppressive silence pressing down on him like a weight. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Mark saw something move, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing on the ledge across the chasm. It was tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The figure stared at him for what felt like an eternity before slowly raising its hand and pointing directly at him. Mark felt a surge of fear and instinctively backed away from the edge, nearly losing his footing on the loose gravel. When he looked back, the figure was gone, and the canyon was once again shrouded in darkness. Without waiting to see if the figure would return, Mark turned and ran, scrambling up the rocky trail as fast as he could. The screams began again, chasing him up the canyon, growing louder and more frantic with each step. It felt as if the very walls of the canyon were closing in on him, the darkness threatening to swallow him whole. He didn't stop running until he was out of the canyon and back on flat ground, his lungs burning and his heart pounding in his chest. The screams had finally stopped, but the memory of them, and the figure with the glowing eyes, haunted him long after he left the canyon behind. Mark never ventured back into that canyon, and he warned others to stay away. The screams were never explained, and the area was quietly removed from the patrol routes. The canyon became another of the park's forbidden places, where something dark and ancient still lurked, waiting to ensnare anyone foolish enough to venture into its depths. Story 18. The Cabin in the Clearing. Ranger Julia had always enjoyed working the night shift. The park took on a different character after dark, the quiet beauty of the forest bathed in moonlight and the soft rustling of leaves, creating a peaceful, almost magical atmosphere. But there was one part of the park she avoided at night, a remote clearing deep in the woods, where an old, abandoned cabin stood. The cabin had been empty for years, its last occupants long gone, leaving behind only rumors and ghost stories. Local legend had it that the cabin was cursed, and anyone who spent the night there would never return. Julia had always dismissed the stories as nonsense, but she couldn't deny the uneasy feeling she got whenever she passed by the clearing. One night, after a particularly long shift, Julia found herself driving past the clearing. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the cabin was barely visible through the thick trees. As she drove by, something caught her eye, a light flickering in one of the cabin's windows. She stopped the vehicle, her curiosity piqued. No one was supposed to be out there, and the cabin had no electricity, so the light didn't make sense. Against her better judgment, Julia decided to investigate. She grabbed her flashlight and made her way down the narrow path that led to the clearing. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under her boots. As she approached the cabin, the light flickered again, a warm yellow glow that seemed out of place in the cold, dark woods. When she reached the clearing, Julia could see the light more clearly. It was coming from a single candle, flickering on the windowsill. The cabin's door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. She hesitated, the stories about the cursed cabin running through her mind, but her training took over, and she pushed the door open. The interior of the cabin was just as she had expected, old, dusty, and filled with cobwebs. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. But what struck her as odd was the table in the center of the room. It was set for dinner, with plates, utensils, and a bottle of wine, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The candle on the windowsill was the only source of light, casting long shadows across the room. Julia stepped closer to the table, her flashlight beam revealing more details. A chair pulled out as if someone had just been sitting there, a half-empty glass of wine, and a book left open to the middle of a page. She reached out to touch the book, but as soon as her fingers brushed the cover, the candle flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Julia's heart raced as she fumbled for her flashlight, but when she turned it on, the beam of light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Then she heard it, a faint, whispering voice coming from the far corner of the room. It was barely audible, but it sent a chill down her spine. She swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just empty space and shadows. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the voice was trying to tell her something. Julia felt a cold breeze brush past her, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the darkness. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and the whispering stopped. The cabin was silent, the air thick with tension. Julia could feel something watching her, something unseen and malevolent. She turned to the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, it remained firmly shut. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped. The room felt smaller, the darkness pressing in around her, and the cold grew more intense. The whispering started again, louder this time, filling the room with a chorus of disembodied voices. Just as she thought she would lose her mind, the door flew open and a gust of cold air rushed in, extinguishing the voices. Julia didn't hesitate. She ran out of the cabin and didn't stop until she was back at her vehicle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She never returned to the clearing after that night, and the cabin was officially declared off-limits. The stories about the curse persisted, and the cabin stood empty, a dark reminder of the secrets hidden deep within the park's woods. Story 19. The Haunted Ranger Tower. Ranger Sam had always felt a sense of pride whenever he climbed the stairs to the old Ranger Tower. It was one of the park's oldest structures, a tall, sturdy tower that offered a breathtaking view of the surrounding forest. Sam often volunteered for the night shifts, enjoying the solitude and the peace that came with watching over the park from above. But there was one night that changed everything, a night when the tower revealed its darkest secrets. It was late autumn, and the wind howled through the trees as Sam climbed the stairs to the tower. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. The tower creaked and groaned as he made his way up, but that was nothing unusual. It was an old structure after all. When he reached the top, Sam settled into his chair, his binoculars in hand, and began his watch. The forest below was dark, the only light coming from the moon and the occasional flicker of a campfire in the distance. Everything seemed normal, and Sam felt at ease as he scanned the horizon. But as the hours passed, something began to change. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the tower, and the air grew colder. Sam adjusted his jacket and continued his watch, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest, usually so alive with the sounds of nature, was unnervingly quiet. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Sam saw movement. He turned, expecting to see a deer or another animal, but there was nothing there, just the empty, moonlit forest. He brushed it off as his imagination, but the unease lingered. A few minutes later, he saw it again, this time more clearly. A shadow moved across the floor of the tower, fleeting and indistinct, but unmistakable. Sam froze, his heart skipping a beat. He knew he was alone in the tower, but the shadow had been there, moving like a figure passing through the room. He stood up, his flashlight in hand, and slowly scanned the room, but there was nothing out of place. The tower was small, just a single room with windows on all sides, offering a 360-degree view of the park. There was nowhere for anyone or anything to hide. As he stood there, trying to make sense of what he had seen, the temperature in the room plummeted. The warmth from the small heater in the corner was no match for the sudden, bone-chilling cold that enveloped the tower. Sam's breath fogged in front of him, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Then he heard it, a faint, shuffling sound like footsteps on the wooden floor. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there, circling the room. Sam's grip tightened on his flashlight as he turned slowly, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the room was empty. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a low, whispering voice filled the room, speaking words Sam couldn't understand. The voice was close, too close, as if someone was standing right behind him. Sam spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was no one there. The voice continued, growing louder and more insistent, echoing off the walls of the tower. It was as if the very air around him was alive with the sound, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Panic set in as Sam realized he was not alone. He grabbed his radio and called for backup, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what was happening. But the radio crackled with static, the signal weak and distorted, as if something was interfering with it. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, and the room seemed to close in around him. Sam felt a pressure in his chest, as if the air itself was pressing down on him, suffocating him. He knew he had to get out of there. Without waiting for a response on the radio, Sam bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time as he fled the tower. The whispers followed him, growing fainter with each step, until they finally faded into silence as he reached the ground. He didn't stop running until he was back at the ranger station, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The other rangers found him pale and shaken, barely able to explain what had happened. After that night, Sam refused to work in the tower again, and it was eventually decommissioned, deemed unsafe for use. The whispers, the shadows, and the bone-chilling cold remained a mystery, but those who had spent time in the tower knew the truth. Something haunted the old structure, something that should never be disturbed.